Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the AI Healthcare Podcast. I'm your host, Dylan Reed, and today we are joined with my friend, Jenn Higgins, who's the SVP of Global Public Affairs at Guardant Health. Jen, thank you again so much for your time today.
Dylan, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I'm a big follower of your newsletter and your podcast, so really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. And to start off the conversation, what led you into the field of AI healthcare, specifically focusing on digestive health?
Great question. I joined Guardant Health 5.5 years ago, right before the COVID-19 pandemic. Had the opportunity to join a company that's really a leader in precision oncology. My previous part of my career, I had spent working in a variety of different healthcare areas in Washington, D.C., actually, in the policy and government affairs space. Primarily focusing in on, health insurers, healthcare providers, startup companies in Silicon Valley, as well as pharmaceutical companies that were all looking at different ways of leveraging technology to help support not only lowering healthcare costs but improving outcomes for patients. So really fortunate to have had this sort of breadth of experience in the healthcare space, starting out in government, spent some time on Wall Street, but over the past 5.5 years, I've really spent and cut my teeth on focusing in on the work that we've done at Guardant as it relates to colorectal cancer and the importance of getting screened.
Awesome. And what is the story behind Guardant Health?
It's a great story, actually. It's funny. Our two founders started the company back in 2012, and really the goal was to create an entirely new category of healthcare, really genomic blood tests for cancer. We've really been the market leader in this space since then, and have continued to sort of expand on the potential of what many people know to be sort of precision oncology or personalized medicine, leveraging the ability to look at molecular characteristics in a patient's tumor and helping them to get on the right targeted therapy. Since that sort of evolution of the company in 2012, we really developed a lot of different solutions in various areas of cancer care. And the idea really was to be across that continuum of care, from those patients who have frankly never had cancer, who are just getting their cancer detected and trying to get screened for cancer, to those who are living as survivors of cancer and able to monitor that cancer and whether it returns post-surgery or post-treatment. And then, most importantly, I think for many of those patients with a late-stage cancer diagnosis, really trying to identify what therapy or treatment they could be on that could help to give them more time with their families and more time living with a late-stage cancer, which we know can be quite traumatic and quite challenging for many people. And frankly, a significant burden on the healthcare system if not done correctly and getting patients on the right therapies. So been really fortunate to sort of see the evolution of our company from the start in 2012, obviously me joining in 2019. But, since I've been there, we've gotten 2 FDA approvals, which has been really a significant milestone for us. We've served close to 750,000 patients across the world, really trying to make sure that we're going to gather as much information as we possibly can about cancer, how it operates in the body, and then leveraging that information to help hopefully inform treatments and eventually a cure.
Awesome. And, it's just amazing to me from what I've been reading and seeing, like, the field of gastroenterology and endoscopy, like, it's the technology has just changed tremendously in that particular
hmm
medical specialty over the past 40, 50 years.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that, we started out at Garden, obviously looking at all of these sort of cancers, really looking at the cancers that are the most deadly cancers. And many of us know that to be lung cancer, colorectal cancer, breast cancer as sort of the major sort of causes of cancer mortality. One of the things that we identified when we look at sort of colorectal cancer is you're absolutely right. There are so many different options for people. And the technology has changed quite a bit from the traditional sort of notion of colonoscopy, which is, again, an endoscope that sort of visualizes your colon, if you will. We've been fortunate to leverage, our technology using the ability to look at DNA in the bloodstream to evaluate, signals in the blood to determine whether a patient has colorectal cancer. And so that type of technology, really serves a lot of different purposes. But what it does allow us to do is to meet people where they are, right? And so when you think about the opportunistic nature of getting a blood test in a doctor's office, or even when you think about, let's say, COVID-19, for example, the idea that you could vaccinate people in a parking lot or, in a field or a pasture, just with the ability to have a doctor on site and to do that, really allows us to do that. We can't quite do colonoscopies in fields just yet, but the reality is we're in a position where we can actually meet people where they are. And so we've seen a lot of opportunity to sort of close that gap for patients who, either, are hourly wage workers who can't take time off work, people who live in communities where they can't travel to another location to get their healthcare easily. We've created an environment where, that technology and the advancement in those technologies allows for a space for millions more people to get screened for cancer.
Mhm. And, growing up, from my experiences, I might have heard like colon cancer maybe once or twice, but it seems like it's getting much more, people are
Hmm.
understanding it a lot more. Is it because of the diagnoses of people getting colorectal cancer is just increased? Is it the diet that people are eating, or like what's causing the increased rates from what you're seeing at
So
Garden Health?
So we completed a 20,000 plus person clinical trial in 2019 through 2022, looking at our tests as compared to colonoscopy in about 300 sites across the country. And it's interesting because at the time that we started the trial, the age of incidence and the age for guidelines, meaning when you should get screened for colorectal cancer, started at 50, right? And so right before that, the American Cancer Society came out and said, actually, we're lowering the age to 45. And so that was a huge announcement on their part because they got ahead of the process. They said, we're looking at all this data and we're seeing people getting cancer at a younger and younger age. We think people should start getting screened now at 45, not at 50. They didn't lower it to 49. They lowered it by 5 full years to 45. At that time, we hadn't launched our trial yet. We were able to adjust our trial protocol to make sure that we were touching those 45-year-olds, not the 50 and over population, which served us well. But since that trial, even since 2019, you're right, we've seen a lot of data that's come out that's shown that people younger and younger are getting, colorectal cancer well below 45. In some cases, we've heard stories of people getting it in their 20s. And so it's a very scary thing to think about the fact that this cancer is changing so rapidly in our system. I think you've heard some of these things. You mentioned diet. There are a lot of different factors that are involved. I haven't seen any clear data as to what the primary driver is, but you're right. I think there is a lot of discussion right now about why that's happening. But I think what it has done, and because there are some high profile people like Chadwick Boseman, who unfortunately died at a very young age of colorectal cancer, people like James Van Der Beek, recently diagnosed with colorectal cancer. Some of the fact that people that are more visible in the pop culture world are getting diagnosed, I think, is also creating a level of awareness about this cancer that maybe hadn't existed previously. I think in my age and time, you had Katie Couric going to get a colonoscopy 10 or 15 years ago, but that wasn't really commonplace for people, in their younger ages of 30 and 40, watching that saying, oh, I need to get screened. So it felt like a much older disease for people to deal with. And so I think the nature of the fact that more and more people that people know on television and the news are being diagnosed is also creating an opportunity for greater awareness about the disease and the need to get screened. So that's where early detection comes in, and it becomes really crucial for people to get screened if they feel as though that's something they should do as soon as they turn 45 or even younger.
I'm glad you brought that up because because in March there's National Colorectal
Mhm.
Cancer Awareness Month. So could you describe kind of what that month is and kind of what it means to you, and how does Garden Health play a role in that, in increasing the awareness of colorectal cancer screening and just overall colorectal health?
Yeah, absolutely. It's colorectal cancer awareness month. If you think back, and again, this is something that we talk about almost every day at Garden. But about 2008, a group came out, the National Colorectal Cancer Roundtable, which is affiliated with the American Cancer Society, and they said we need to get screening rates to 80%. Right, like we need 80% of people that are eligible to get screened for CRC in this country to get screened. That was over 10 years ago. And unfortunately, despite all these great technological advancements, we're still in a place where we're creating awareness, yet people aren't getting screened. We have 50 million Americans who are unscreened for colorectal cancer. It's that they have options and they're not choosing to get screened. And so we think an opportunistic option like Shield creates a space for that. So a lot of our work over the past, 5-10 years has been spending that month of March and the rest of the year talking about the importance and awareness of getting screened and early detection for cancer. Colorectal cancer is obviously important because it is the first sort of our ability to bring a product to patients that can help them get screened for colorectal cancer. And we think this will obviously help to increase rates. A lot of our data shows that compared to maybe some of the other options out there, you can see this sort of 90+% adherence rate for something like a blood test, because it's that easy for a patient to do, where something like colonoscopy and in some cases some of the at-home options are much lower. So getting to that 80%, we think a blood test helps us get to that 80%. So a big part of our mission has been trying to make sure we educate patients about the importance of getting screened, how easy it is now to get screened thanks to a blood test like Shield, and then creating the space for us to partner. And I know this is something that you're passionate about, for us to partner directly with major patient advocacy organizations like Fight CRC, the Colorectal Cancer Alliance, Colon Cancer Coalition. These are groups that are really the resource for patients to get information. Guardant is not the primary resource for people to get information about colorectal cancer. These groups are. And so we work very closely with them, not only to give them information about the work that we're doing in the space and the great research that we're doing to look at ways to not only evaluate early detect cancer, but also to look at ways to monitor patients with colorectal cancer who've had stage 2 or stage 3 cancer, and making sure that they have that information. So working with them, working with oncologists, working with primary care doctors, and partnering with them to share as much information as possible about the important work we're doing to help increase adherence to colorectal cancer screening. Ultimately, I think, the month of CRC Awareness Month in March is about saving lives, right? It's about finding a way to close that gap to that 80%, and letting people know at the end of the day that it's not acceptable that, we see 5-year survival, obviously, at a very low rate if we can't catch it early. And so we want that number to be that 91%, where we can get people to live with a very preventable disease if they get screened early.
And to go off of what you said earlier, so the lower recommendation of 45, does that like could you get screened earlier than 45 if you wanted
Yeah.
to?
That's up to, I mean, again, that's a patient preference and that's a physician preference. But the way that clinical guidelines work is that the American Cancer Society, as well as the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, look at available evidence and published evidence and data to make a determination about incidence rates and other factors around age-specific mortality to determine 45 is the age at which we think is appropriate. I mean, you can imagine a scenario where we started screening people at 20 years old, and the amount of like burden on the system potentially. Unfortunately, a good example, colonoscopy. And I know you talk about this a great deal on your podcast in terms of cost of the healthcare system and rising healthcare costs. One of the things that you can imagine is a scenario where unfortunately there aren't enough GIs to do all of the colonoscopies in this country. If every person who needed a colonoscopy went to get one today, there'd be a waiting list a year or 2 years long. So adjusting that age, having more options for screening is likely to get more people screened, but that becomes a patient preference. Our preference, obviously, in our FDA approval and labeling is for 45 to 84 years old. But the expectation is that I think as data and evidence comes to bear, that age will lower. Physicians will be more inclined to screen people under 45. But again, patient preference, physician preference at the end of the day is about what's best for a patient.
Awesome. And there are two programs that Guardant Health participates in heavily. So it's the Medicare Guardian Reveal program, and then the NCI Vanguard study at the NIH. Could you just
Mhm.
describe what those two initiatives are, and how does it relay kind of the mission of Guardant Health to raise awareness of colorectal cancer screening?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think I mentioned this earlier, but one of the things that our founders really bought into when they built Guardant Health in 2012 was this idea that we could support patients across the continuum of cancer care. We are fortunate not just to be in a space where we're looking at colorectal cancer through the lens of early detection, but we're also looking at it through the lens of those patients who have been diagnosed with colorectal cancer, whether that be patients who were diagnosed at that sort of stage 2, stage 3, who are getting, let's say resective surgery. They're having part of their colon removed, they're having their tumor removed, and then they're receiving some form of chemotherapy to follow. Or those patients who have a late stage cancer who are getting on a targeted therapy for, let's say, a KRAS mutation. Those patients are definitely in a position where they have the ability to leverage our technology in a different way. And so we have a test called Guardant Reveal, which is laser focused on helping to support that recurrence monitoring and longitudinal monitoring of colorectal cancer. Because you can imagine a scenario where a patient gets a surgery, gets chemotherapy, and they go to their doctor and they say, Did you get all of it? Is the cancer gone? And that can oftentimes be very hard to identify on a CT scan, and it can take longer to identify it on a CT scan. In some cases, 6 to 8 months longer than we can look at it in the blood. And so the ability to look at circulating tumor DNA in a bloodstream can tell us with relative accuracy that at the end of the day, that patient still has that colorectal cancer, and allows the doctor and the patient to make informed decisions about it. So our ability to do that, as well as to monitor whether that patient's cancer has returned with a blood test on a regular cadence, is really a game changer for many cancer survivors. And I think that's something that, we have worked very hard on, is to make sure that we can use Guardant Reveal in the sort of what we call surveillance setting. We were very fortunate about a couple weeks ago to receive Medicare coverage for Guardant Reveal in that surveillance setting. So now Medicare patients are in a position to be able to use this blood test, and their physician to use this blood test to make sure that they have information and can monitor that cancer and surveil that cancer accordingly. You know this better than anybody, but just like a lot of the things that we talk about in the AI space and other areas, cancer is constantly changing, right? It's
Mhm.
learning in your body. And so our ability to learn with that cancer, to understand it, and then provide that information to an oncologist is going to help ultimately inform treatment, but will also ultimately help inform cures. To the other question that you asked, again, some of the efforts that have been ongoing throughout the government have really been focused on looking at what we call multi-cancer detection tests. So not just looking at a blood test or a mechanism to detect colorectal cancer in the blood, but to be able to detect numerous cancers in the blood and provide that information to a physician and to a patient. We were fortunate to be selected as part of a study that is being run out of the National Cancer Institute as part of the Cancer Screening Research Network, called the Vanguard study. We are one of 2 participants in that study. And the goals there is really to evaluate the feasibility of using these tests for cancer screening. And so we're incredibly excited to have the opportunity to be a part of what we view as very seminal research through the government to help support the development and commercialization of these tests. Patients are very eager to see multi-cancer tests. There are some on the market, none that are FDA approved, but Guardant, as a pioneer in this space, has a tremendous opportunity to partner with the government and to identify patients for a very large-scale clinical trial throughout the country to better understand how we can bring these tests to patients more readily in a compliant and regulated way.
Awesome. And you referred to this a little bit earlier in the conversation, but how do you see Guardant Health contributing to the greater AI healthcare policy conversation that we're having right now?
It's interesting because Guardant's slogan and our motto is "Conquer Cancer with Data," and I think there are a lot of people who go, "Well, what does that actually mean?" Right? And I think it hits at the core of what you talk about every single day and every single week on this podcast, which is really this notion that we are looking at tremendous amounts of data and large data sets to really increase the accuracy of the genomic and diagnostic information we're able to provide through our tests. We have tested, over 500,000 patients. We've got a tremendous data set that allows us to learn about cancer and how it's changing in the body and create and evaluate, what is truly precision medicine. In terms of the work on AI, it's interesting because, our priorities have really been to kind of continue to evolve our technology in a way that is really going to benefit even more patients over the next 10 years. And in one piece of that, we've looked at, our Infinity platform, which we developed, about a year and a half ago. And the goal there was really to sort of not just look at genomic information, but to look at the epigenomic information, leveraging artificial intelligence to offer sort of a multi-dimensional view of a patient's cancer. This hasn't been done before. Guardant is the first company to do it. And again, this is going to allow us to collect even more information about the mechanisms of cancer, how it operates in the body, and then presumably give us the ability to help people obviously predict disease as they are looking to find the cure for that disease, and hopefully help our biopharma partners develop much more effective therapies. This information is so critical, but having that large data set using machine learning and AI allows us to be transformative in our ability to better understand cancer than most people and most companies, but also to take our technology, update that algorithm, harness that technology in a way that it can detect many cancers with a high degree of accuracy and help those people get the treatment that they need, and hopefully have the peace of mind that they have the information they need to make an informed decision about their cancer.
Mhm. And then Just off that thought, where do you see Guardant Health playing a role in, recent initiatives that this current administration has announced, such as Stargate?
Yeah, great question. I think we were excited and then maybe somewhat surprised by some of the remarks that were made at the Stargate announcement. I think in a good way. I think it's always good to have people talking about the fact that you can detect cancer through tiny fragments of DNA in the blood. But that's what Guardant's been doing for almost 15 years now, and we've really been a pioneer in this space. So it made it sound a little like science fiction, but the reality is it's actually the future's here, and it's been here for quite some time, and we know that it's an important sort of tool that we have. I think that the applications of AI and the ability to build that infrastructure and leverage it, to Ellison's point, to the advancement of perhaps a cancer vaccine down the line is important progress that I think companies like Guardant and others will continue to work together with the government and other stakeholders on. But we were pleased to see the announcement around Stargate, and I think excited to understand sort of how we can help support, play a role in providing information and insight about our important work on colorectal cancer, but also on many other cancers using that very large data set that I mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm. And then, lastly, what do policymakers need to understand when enacting, proposals that impact the colorectal cancer community, specifically when it comes to AI?
Yeah, I think, I mentioned obviously, Shield, our screening test, is obviously utilizing, an AI-based algorithm to detect that positive signal for CRC. We've been leveraging that in our technology for some time. I think the thing that has been most interesting to me about some of the conversation on Capitol Hill about this, and even in the previous administration, has really been this notion of a one size fits all approach. I think the reality of the situation is, as we know, AI is used in healthcare in a lot of different forms and functions and applications. We're looking at it from the standpoint of how we leverage it in the space of detection of cancer. But the reality is, a one size fits all approach is really going to ultimately stifle innovation. And so we're pleased to see some of the early conversations around Stargate and otherwise really examining the ability to let companies do the work, that important work that they're doing, with some awareness of the implications of that technology and what those guardrails look like. I would also say, too, if you look at the FDA, for example, the FDA has obviously been regulating AI as part of medical devices for almost 2 decades now. So the notion that the FDA has a purview and a remit, maybe we don't need to be reinventing the wheel here, but we need to be taking a closer look at what we can do to help support innovators, minimize that regulatory burden, and I think ultimately make sure that we're supporting technology that's going to have a regulatory paradigm that helps that get into the hands of patients.
Awesome. And Jen, where can people find out kind of more about the work that you are doing at Guardant Health?
Two things. One, I think you can go to guardanthealth.com, or you can go to Shield Cancer Screen to learn more about our cancer screening test, Shield. But more importantly, I think if you have questions, comments, concerns about the importance of cancer screening, obviously reach out to your advocacy organizations like the American Cancer Society, Fight CRC, as well as Colorectal Cancer Alliance, to learn more about the importance of getting screened and the opportunities and different options available for you.
Awesome. And be sure to subscribe to the AI Healthcare Podcast YouTube channel, and also listen to the audio version of this interview on Spotify and Apple Podcast. Jen, thank you again so much again for your time today.
Thanks, Dylan. I appreciate the time.
This is Dylan Reed signing off.